It's no surprise that people are obsessed with the Marvel miniseries MoonKnight. It is an embarrassment of riches, combining way too many interesting and awesome things into 6 episodes. An immersive and fascinating world based on one of the world's oldest spiritual traditions, a compelling storyline starring 2 well-written character foils who are portrayed excellently, and a banging soundtrack featuring music that is so good it should be banned. No, Egypt, that was just a figure of speech. I didn't really— Aw, come on. But its most captivating element is arguably the fact that it features one of the most enigmatic and misunderstood conditions in the DSM, Dissociative Identity Disorder. The protagonist's struggle is not just an external one against cult leaders and giant, overbearing talking roadkill, but an internal one between his multiple personalities. And it is in this regard that MoonKnight stands alone in media. This series does what so many other media portrayals of this disorder fail to do. It shows the progression, the origin, and treatment of DID. This is why MoonKnight is the best. Hello, I'm Willarius the Therapist, a real-life shrink for real people who moonlights as a diagnostician for the people who live in your laptop. My self-care is really good. If you like binge-watching television shows while learning mental health facts that you can throw out at Thanksgiving this year, hit the subscribe button to join our treatment team. I've been at this for 4 years now, and somehow in that time, I've managed to talk about dissociative identity disorder only once, despite the fact that both mental health professionals and the general public can't get enough of it. It's beyond interesting from an intellectual perspective. It's a condition that challenges the very notion of what it even means to be a person, and confronts us with a variety of existential questions like, if your girl knows you have dissociative identity disorder and kisses one of your alters, is she really your girl? Some questions, sadly, will not have an answer, but one question we will answer today is which portrayal of dissociative identity disorder is the best in media? MoonKnight. MoonKnight absolutely sticks the landing when it comes to discussing the origin, progression, and treatment of dissociative identity disorder, and does so in a way that I haven't seen in any TV shows. Let's get to the analysis. Enter identity autobiographical amnesia. When someone walks into your therapy chair for the first time and asks for help, one of the first things that you will ask them for is their symptoms. This may come as a shock to you, but not everyone who says they have DID actually does. So there are things we need to look for in order to make the proper judgment call that the best explanation for someone's situation is multiple personalities. In the first episode, we are introduced to Stephen Grant. Stephen is a mild-mannered Egyptology enthusiast who just wants to work at the museum and eat a steak. Why can't Stephen have a steak? Well, because he has severe sleep issues. He has periods of days, sometimes weeks, where he has a dissociative fugue state and doesn't remember what happened. He has sleepwalking that's so severe there are a bedroom full of traps, ropes, and shards of glass in his shoes. It's not a sex thing, shut up, Freud. Stephen is a sleepwalker. Later in episode 1, we realize why Stephen has been sleepwalking, and we are introduced to Mark Spector. Mark Spector is in many ways the exact opposite of Stephen Grant. He's a highly capable soldier, a daring thief, and he has a contempt for public restrooms that, to be honest, is just obscene, considering everything we've been through during a lockdown. Seriously, Mark, how could you do that to the loo?
You messed up the loos. I don't, mate. Larry in maintenance is gonna absolutely shoot you.
Well, because he doesn't care. He doesn't have a helpful little song telling you how to spell his name, despite the fact that he uses the statistically less common C spelling of Mark. He doesn't care what you think. He's an arbiter of divine justice. He's married to a conventionally attractive woman, and he is one salt and pepper beard away from being the most interesting man in the world. Mark is such a larger-than-life Superman that you're expecting him to be the alter. But obviously, if you've seen the show already, or if you're a true fan and read the comics before the show even came out, feel free to brag about it in the comments. If you did, then you know that Mark Spector is actually the base personality. This bait and switch works because when you see DID in media, it's normally the mild-mannered normie who's the base personality, and the second personality is a super strong, super brave alter who protects the normie from danger. But as I'll show in the next section, in real life, just like in MoonKnight, it's sometimes the big, strong personality that's the one that needs protecting. But before we get to that, I want to draw attention to the first important way MoonKnight does justice to dissociative identity disorder. It does a very good job in portraying what is called inter-identity autobiographical amnesia, which is a definitely too complicated way of saying the alters don't remember what the other is doing. We see for most of the show, Mark doesn't remember what Steve was doing when Mark has the body, and vice versa, unless one of them is looking into a mirror and viewing the other one from a third-person perspective. It's a neat plot device, but doesn't seem super realistic. But it's actually a bit more realistic than you may realize. I think one of the reasons that people are fascinated by dissociative identity disorder is that it seems so exotic. The idea that someone can be living their life in one continuity of consciousness and then suddenly phase out and start living their life in a completely different continuity of consciousness without remembering what they were doing in the other continuity seems really out there. But it isn't. In fact, you have definitely done this in the last 48 hours. You see, when you go to sleep, you have the normal continuity of your understanding of life suddenly interrupted, and then you find yourself in a completely different continuity doing something else or even being someone else. Like, do you remember that dream you had exactly 2 nights ago? Where you and Master Chief from Halo were defending your middle school from an army of mutant carrots from space that were trying to steal everyone's brains? You seriously don't remember that? I do, and I think about it a lot. Sorry, I lost the thread. That wasn't my point. My point is, I can see your dreams, Tom. The point is that when neurotypical people are dreaming, they are often doing things that they normally wouldn't do, or being people that they don't identify with. In essence, they're very suddenly dissociating into a different identity and different continuity of consciousness, without remembering who they normally are. And brain scans have shown that a number of people cannot remember their dreams, even when measures of delta wave show that they are dreaming. So what that means is a significant portion of the population regularly has the experience of having a sudden discontinuity in their consciousness and then dissociating into an identity state that is separate from the one that they normally occupy, and often they can't remember details from one continuity of consciousness to the other. This is why one of the very promising theories about the origin of dissociative identity disorder is that it's a malfunction in the way the brain goes from waking to sleeping. It's an almost unintentional auto-hypnosis. One of the big pieces of evidence for this is the frequent co-occurrence of sleeping problems with dissociative identity disorder. And in the same way people mostly forget facts from their other timeline when they're in an alternative one, people with dissociative identity disorder often cannot remember what was happening in the other timeline. Some patients have been able to increase their awareness between the alters even while the other one is active. So if you think about this condition as analogous to dreaming, then this recall would be analogous to lucid dreaming, being in a dream but having awareness that you're in a dream, and therefore preserving your awareness of your other identity. And studies on lucid dreaming show that it can be induced by mindfully engaging a third-person perspective. That is, having the perspective of an outsider looking in like your reflection staring back at you. So that's pretty cool, and one way in which MoonKnight nails this portrayal of dissociative identity disorder. The etiology of dissociative identity disorder. The condition that Mark Spector is shown to have in the series is an extreme response to severe childhood trauma. This factor of dissociative identity disorder is so important to our understanding of the condition that it's actually an important way clinicians distinguish people who are really suffering from DID with people who are malingering. Malingering is the technical term for when someone is faking symptoms of a condition in order to get attention or some other secondary gain. If a malingering person is trying to convince a clinician that they have DID, they will often embellish the qualities and quantities of the alters. And so the description you'll get is a fleet of interesting but largely thematically unrelated characters. Kind of like this. Hi there, thanks for coming in. So you had mentioned you're experiencing multiple personalities. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I have a few of them. One's a genius scientist
Who invents things. Things that blow up. One of them is another genius scientist. He's mild-mannered, but he gets angry. Real angry. You wouldn't like him when he's angry. One of them's a girl. A Russian spy. Very dangerous. One of them's a god of thunder who's in charge of an enchanted weapon. And one of them is a good old-fashioned World War II era soldier man who's here to chew gum and punch Nazis, and he's all out of gum! Okay. What I hear you saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, But what I hear you saying is that you personally are the Avengers. Yeah, that's right. We need to protect the Infinity Stones from Thanos! No, those are breath mints and you cannot have that many! Thanks, I'm cured! Every time. In contrast, life with dissociative identity disorder is less of a fascinating fad and more of living with a debilitating dysfunction. And the origin of this alienation is a personal history of incredibly invasive pain. In real dissociative identity cases, we will see the legacy of this pain in the creation of the alters. Most of the time, the alters, but especially the first alter that emerges, has a very clear connection with the trauma or traumas that resulted in the dissociation in the first place. Often the purpose of this alter is to help the primary personality deal with their situation. But what does a man like Mark Spector need help with? And how does a man like Stephen Grant give him that help? Previously on this channel, we used Jungian psychology to illustrate how a person can come to believe that an underutilized portion of their own personality is an entirely different person. And I think our boy Carl can help us understand Mark. Jung's system is about the contrast of opposites. In other words, the more that you engage one type of cognitive or mental state, the more that its opposite is repressed in your mind and underdeveloped. Now, of course, Jung's system doesn't fit everyone perfectly, and there are a number of criticisms of it. But for people who split their personality between at least two seemingly unlike extremes, I think that the system can tell us a lot. So, using this system, let's take a look at Mark Spector. Mark Spector is a very bottom-line oriented, realistic, practically and physically capable person and is extremely brave. He is what clinicians call an alpha. Obviously, the term alpha is not at all a clinical term to describe human personality, and there are so many problems with the construct that it isn't likely to ever be a truly scientific term. However, since most of you more or less know what it means, I'll keep using it because we have a shared understanding of this term, and this isn't school. In this system, Mark's personality very closely correlates with the description of the extroverted thinking type. He's logical, he's evidence-based, and because he's so focused on external objects and outcomes, he's action-oriented, practical, and very confident.
In accordance with his definition, we must picture a man whose constant aim is to bring his total life activities into relation with intellectual conclusions. This type of man gives the deciding voice not merely for himself alone, but also on behalf of his entourage, either to the actual objective reality or to its objectively oriented intellectual formulae. By this formula are good and evil measured, and beauty and ugliness determined. All is right that corresponds with this formula, all is wrong that contradicts it. Because this formula seems to correspond with the meaning of the world, it also becomes a world law, whose realization must be achieved at all times and seasons, both individually and collectively. Just as the extroverted thinking type subordinates himself to his formula, so, for its own good, must his entourage also obey it. Since the man who refuses to obey is wrong, he is resisting the world law, and is therefore unreasonable, immoral, and without a conscience.
Dude, Carl Jung was Swiss. Why are you talking like that?
Well, poppycock!
Personality is fairly consistent over time, so if this is a good personality description of Mark Spector, we should expect to see versions of it in his childhood. And in the flashback to his childhood, we do see a brave, self-assured, and natural leader kind of kid. A kid with a sort of confidence that comes from being at least as, if not more, competent than his peers, and someone who is used to controlling his environment and usually succeeds at doing that. But no one can really control everything all the time. Eventually, a person like this is confronted with a negative outcome that can't be fixed, that no new accomplishment can make up for. And because they have this "you're only as good as your last performance" bias, this shakes him to his core. That would be enough all by itself, but on top of all of that, he has an alcoholic and verbally and physically mother who is constantly saying that this is his fault. And not only that, the shame of this becomes a fundamental part of how he understands himself. And in the face of this, a person who is used to having all the answers has no solutions. According to Jung, this personality is created by repressing the function of introverted feeling. The prioritization of introverted feeling lends itself to an imaginative, meek, soft-spoken, and withdrawn personality that in many ways is the exact opposite of the fire-breathing, butt-kicking, extroverted thinking person. With all the things that Stephen Grant lacks that Mark Spector has, what Stephen does have is a sense of himself that is based on his own internal values, that isn't up for debate or can be won or lost in a contest. He's the person who can take a beating and go on believing that he's worthwhile. He doesn't need achievement to believe in himself, because the basis of his self-identity is internal. Stephen Grant isn't just a random psychological novelty, but a defense mechanism that met a real need for the main personality. But this rupture in identity isn't indefinitely sustainable. How does a person with dissociative identity disorder get out of it? This is where many media portrayals of this condition stop, but MoonKnight takes us home and does it in an extremely accurate way. The treatment of dissociative identity disorder. TV shows and movies often skip over the treatment portion of having a mental health condition, despite the fact that it's probably the most genuinely dramatic part of the journey. And with dissociative identity disorder especially, how the treatment is portrayed in media, whenever it is usually not great. It ranges from the bad to the, wow, that is so bad, I'm not even going to joke about that. So here comes MoonKnight. How does MoonKnight treat Mark Spector's dissociative identity disorder? Well, it's simple, really. He dies, refuses to go to the afterlife, walks with his alter through a near-death experience, has his alter throw himself into the sands of damnation, and then comes back to life. That is the very fundamentally sound near-death experience talking hippopotamus treatment system that we all learn in our first year in therapist school. So obviously no, but hidden in this very out there sequence of events is a very realistic portrayal of how people with dissociative identity disorder and other traumatic disorders resolve their symptoms. This is a lifeline. It may not look like much, some rope, some stones, and flowers, but as someone who has done this intervention with a number of people, this rope may be the longest 3 yards a person walks through in their life. The Lifeline activity is a part of an evidence-based trauma intervention called narrative exposure therapy. As part of the beginning of the intervention, the person uses the rope to tell the story of their life. Flowers represent positive memories and good emotional resources. The stones represent traumatic and haunting memories. This real-life intervention is like having your life flash before your eyes. Then, one by one, the therapist addresses each memory in a narrative exposure therapy session. This is where the client is asked to vividly describe the details of the traumatic events. Everything from sensory memories, emotional memories, logical memories, and chronological ones. It is very difficult, which is why it requires special training on the part of the therapist and a lot of grounding work on the part of the client before they're ready to begin. One of the reasons this works is that it's helping to reassemble a person's narrative into a coherent whole. Trauma disrupts the brain's ability to communicate with itself. One of the many things that goes wrong is a disruption between the communication between the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is responsible for, among many other things, the fight or flight response, and the hippocampus, among many other things, is responsible for storing memories and placing them in a sense of time and personal continuity. The narrative exposure, while unpleasant, helps to stimulate the connection between these two brain regions and helps put the trauma in a proper chronological context. Over time, it helps the amygdala not respond to the memory as if it is something that is currently happening. What we see Mark Spector go through in the show is a type of narrative exposure therapy. Mark Spector travels with a trusted confidant through the darkest parts of his life, seeing them, but also putting them in proper context so that he can move on. And by doing so, realizing that he does have the emotional resources to confront vulnerability and still remain himself. This is a crucial thing to understand. Stephen didn't die. Stephen can't die. He's a construct of Mark's subconscious. Stephen jumping off the boat is the realization that this construct is baggage. Mark has what Stephen has. Mark can be that emotionally present and vulnerable person that his wife has asked him to be and that his life has demanded of him. And this amazing series shows this inspiring moment of liberation that real trauma survivors can experience, and giving it all the gravity, seriousness, and joy that it deserves. So what do you think? Have I convinced you that MoonKnight is the best portrayal of dissociative identity disorder? Leave a comment letting me know what your opinion is. While you're at it, please like and share this video so the YouTube algorithm doesn't register me as dead when I don't upload a video tomorrow. If you'd like to learn more about the psychology of personality, click here. I'm Willarius the Therapist. Thanks for watching.